Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky. Yep, same last name as the other guy in this group. And I'm the author of about 50 works of fiction and nonfiction.
I'm Molly Jo Reilly, not the same last name as either one of them. And I am the curator of the Unemployment Cookbook, producer of the First in Fiction podcast, and welcome to what is already starting out to be quite a fun evening.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I mentioned the good news. I think I may have, but we are the #1 podcast starring two people with the last name Gansky.
And a producer last name Reilly.
Yeah, it's a very prestigious category. Very prestigious category. So still
right.
#1.
Yay! Round of applause for all of us.
That reminds me of Amazon, the bestseller list that Amazon has. Mm-hmm. You can be on the bestseller list, but it's like 15 levels deep. You know, so I've had books like when we were doing the Harbingers, and we'll be number 3 in a devotional Christian novella, supernatural thriller. Or something like that, about 5 levels, 6 levels deep, and woohoo, we're number 2. If you go deep enough, everybody's
can you imagine being number 7 on that list, number 8? I was number 1. The Bargain was number 1 for a while in one of the categories, but it was about 15 categories deep. So still
don't put yourself down. It was only 14 levels deep. I'm
going to go ahead and say that I'm a best-selling author. Anyway, moving on. Reminder to those of you listening to us on the audio podcast, if you want to join us live, you can do that at aarongansky.com every other Tuesday night at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can chat along with us and ask us questions in the chat room. It's always a lot of fun. If you are watching us on YouTube, we ask that you hit that thumbs up button. Helps us out quite a bit. And also don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We are approaching 200 subscribers, so that's kind of exciting. Would love to hit that milestone there. So share with your friends. And recently, if you've subscribed to our newsletter, you noticed we actually sent one out. And by we, I mean Molly sent one out. So thanks, Molly, for that. If you are interested in getting some more information, especially on our off weeks, you can subscribe to that newsletter down at the bottom, aarongansky.com/firstsinfictionlive. And it's right there at the bottom. You can put your email address in there, and we promise not to bug you too much, but especially on our off weeks, we like to kind of keep in touch with you. So that's where you do that.
And when Aaron is saying off weeks, he doesn't mean like off like a bad day for the rest of us. Maybe for him, I don't know. But yes. Off week just meaning the weeks that we're not live on air.
Good point. Yeah. And we'll have links to Firsts in Fiction from the Vault. So we'll have links to old episodes that might be of interest and note to you, especially if you kind of get that itch on Tuesday nights and you want to watch us live and you can't because we're not broadcasting live. You can always an old episode and catch something that you haven't seen before, or rewatch something that was impactful to you the first time. Whatever strikes your fancy. So
before we get into, I know you're headed for Novel Spotlight, but also with the reviews and the likes, give First in Fiction podcast a like on Facebook and on Twitter. Share them, give us some likes, leave a review. We really are trying to, of course, get some corporate sponsorship by way of, Aaron needs a private jet. Al wants about 100 more new old antique typewriters. I'm easy. I could just deal with another 50 cats and we're good.
50 cats. All the money in the world and you want 50 cats.
So. Didn't say all the money in the world. Then I also want food to feed them.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good point. So, okay. Well, thank you for that. And Molly does all our social media, so she's keen on that. We, Pops and I, not so much. We are not gifted in that area. So thanks, Molly, for all that. Sure. Pops, Novel Spotlight. What do you got?
Well, for our novel spotlight for this week, I'm going to talk about a Stephen King novel, 11/22/63. Came out in 2011. Simon & Schuster published the book, and it's a pretty thick book, as some of Stephen King's books are. In fact, it's even proper to call it a tome, which is a great big book. 850 pages. I'm such a slow reader, I usually don't take those books on, or I'll count them as 6 books or something in my reading log. King is very interesting. I don't always like the stories he tells, but I can never criticize the way he tells them. He is an excellent writer, and I've learned a lot from reading his stuff. There are some that he's written that I've just dearly loved. This was one of them that I found very unique, and it was later made into a miniseries. And you can watch that. Some of you might recognize the date, 11/22/63. That's when JFK was shot. What made this book very interesting for me was, although the premise was not new, there have been Twilight Zone episodes and other programs where somebody travels back in time to keep Kennedy from being shot, and then always encounters some kind of problem. Well, King does that, but what makes it interesting here is the way he makes the plot. Well, he puts so many complexities in it. So it's not really a time travel piece. It's a guy who has an acquaintance. The protagonist is a teacher, just like Aaron, is a teacher. And he notices the guy who owns the diner doesn't look all that well. He looks sick and he looks much older. And this is one of the premises that below the diner, if we walk down the stairs, this is in the book, it's a little different in the video version of it. But if you go down the stairs, it will take you back in time to a particular moment in time. You can't go to any moment. You have to go to that moment. And if you come back, it all resets. And if you go back down again, you'll go back to the exact moment as before. And it's not all that close to 1963. It's several years. So that's one of the complexities put in. It's a great lesson for the building of a plot. It's cliche to say we're going to send somebody back in time in this story and have them try to save JFK from an assassin's bullet. But then when you start making it almost impossible to do and showing why it's impossible, then it becomes a really interesting story. And for the guy to do that, he has to live in the past for a number of years. Now, here's the key that makes this even more complex and more difficult is he ages back there at a regular rate. So if you're living in his current time and he goes down these stairs and comes back, he can look 5 years older. And then if something gets messed up, as you just know it's going to happen, he has to start all over again. And now he's still older, and he'll be older by the time he gets to this, and on it goes.
Wow.
But yeah, it's really kind of complex. And then there's a tie into the janitor in his school who was taking an adult class and who was injured by his father. Well, his father, at the time that injury took place, is at the same time our protagonist is in the past. So it's very complex. It's intricate. It has lots of little twists to it, things you don't expect to come up, and some great phraseology. One line that keeps repeating, and he never makes a big deal of it. He just keeps repeating this one line is, time is obdurate, meaning it's resistant. It doesn't want to change. And you'll see that maybe 10 times in this book of 850 pages. But also, and one reason I wanted to use this, because I was thinking of you, Aaron, it's got one of the best opening lines I've read. Aaron wrote a small nonfiction book on first lines. If you don't have that, you need to get it. It's really great. I would put this one in there because the first line in the book is, I've never been what you'd call a crying man. And you read that, what do you learn? It's first person. Second, the guy isn't overly emotional, but even his phraseology, a tightly written sentence would be, I don't cry often. That's probably the tightest sentence you can get. King doesn't want a tight sentence. He wants to reflect his character, and this is the way the guy talks. I've never been what you would call a crying man. And that pops up from time to time. So it's a great book for all of those things and the technique. And it's one of those that, it must have given him migraines to plot. But it all works out. So that's my novel spotlight. Stephen King's 11/22/63.
A very, very good book. Very long. And that first line, yes, you definitely get the voice of the character and a little bit of conflict. He's kind of almost making a promise to the reader. I've never been what you'd call a crying man. It sends a message to the reader. Eventually, this guy's probably going to cry. And we want to know what it is that brings him to tears if he's not overly emotional. So Yeah, very, very good first line there, Pops. Thanks for that. I've read that book, enjoyed it quite a bit. Have not seen, what is it, a Hulu series that they made it into?
I forget. Someone has loaned me the DVDs. But yeah, it was a cable company like that. HBO, Netflix, Hulu. I think maybe you're right. I think maybe it was Hulu that did it.
I'll check.
All right, she's on it. If we had Testa Gruda in the chat room, she'd be on it too.
I know she's not. That's why I'm volunteering.
It'd be a race.
Yeah, she'd probably already have it. She'd have it before we even asked the question. So.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's jump into our topic today, which has to do with juggling multiple plot lines. This is an interesting week. We're kind of finishing up our last look at writer psychology, and we're gearing up for another series of podcasts, which we'll talk a little bit about toward the end of the episode. But we had an open week, and I wanted to save this for a viewer submitted topic. And if you're interested in submitting a topic for us, you can do that at aarongansky.com. There's a little contact button. You can just shoot me an email that way, and I'll get it, and I'll keep that in our list of suggested topics. But this one comes today from Bradley S. Cobb, and it's interesting. He contacted me, but Pops, I think he was really trying to get to you, or at least to pick your brain, because he writes, "My question is about something that impressed me with the Perry Sachs novels," which, Pops, that's your series. And also Clive Cussler's Dirk Pitt novels as well. They seem to seamlessly blend together seemingly random plot lines into one grand tale. How do you come up with or decide on these various plot lines? And how much rewriting do you end up having to do in order to integrate these various threads of story throughout your novels? I thought that was a great question. It's not exactly one that you can just kind of answer neatly and succinctly in a paragraph. And so I thought this would be worthy of a full podcast. And we haven't really done much on this, at least not recently. We've got some older podcasts that I did with Steve where we tackled this particular topic. But Pops, you have a unique perspective on this. He named your series the Perry Sachs series by name. And so what are your kind of reactions to that particular question?
Well, I appreciate him mentioning the Perry Sachs novels. Perry Sachs is the only character I have that ever received a wedding proposal from a reader. He had to turn her down.
Aww.
Yeah, it was sad. It really had to do with they just didn't have much in common. She was real and he wasn't. So
did he really turn her down? Like, did he actually write a nice note and say, "I'm sorry," or did you just forget it?
It was I was doing a conversation with a group in Texas. It was a phone conversation, a readers group, and they had read the Perry Sachs books. And that was the first question. Will he marry me?
Oh, that's funny.
Hey, I don't know. We're not talking anymore. He's mad about the ending of the last story. So, yeah. But I think what we need to understand as we get into this is part of writing a normal length or longer novel. So let's say you're going to have a novel of 80,000 words or greater. You're going to have multiple plot lines, and that means that we as writers have to be jugglers. We have to be able to keep these things going in our head, and at times it's difficult to do. And that's why I think it's important to always keep reading what you've written before, and you keep doing that until it's branded in your brain. So if you finish a scene and the next day, before you write the next scene, you go back and read the previous one. This speed up your editing a little bit, but it'll also keep you in the same flow, and keep notes sometimes of who's doing what where, especially if they're happening in different places around the world. Perry Sachs is really an engineer, but he's a bit of an adventurer, and he has a team. So this is an ensemble piece for those that haven't read the Perry Sachs novels. It's an ensemble piece. It's really written with guys in mind. It's a kind of adventure thing, and very much a nod to Clive Cussler and his books with the Dirk Pitts, which is also an ensemble piece. In fact, there was a guy who's a Clive Cussler, Dirk Pitt fan, perhaps an expert, challenged Perry Sachs to a duel. And since Perry Sachs is an engineer in construction, I said he's happy to accept that. And it will be track hose at 50 paces, big equipment, construction equipment. I figured he could win that one. So keeping them so they seamlessly blend together is difficult, and sometimes it just takes note-taking. It takes practice. It takes observation, and you're reading about how the people do it. But it is really the norm to have multiple plot points, multiple plot lines, I should say, and multiple points of view in the larger, I'd say from the standard novel on. Not so much in novellas because you don't have as much room to work with that, but you can still have those. And if you're doing third person point of view, it's always desirable. Some have suggested that most bestsellers have this kind of multi-point of view, multi-plot line that helps make them a bestseller because it gives you more stuff to do, more pairs of eyes to see through, and you can pull it all back together. So each plot line is going to develop a little bit of mystery to it, and at some point they all come together and tie up the story in a very little neat bundle with that. So the only time I don't use multiple plot lines in a novel is in a very short novel, or if I'm writing in first person. But if I'm doing a regular novel that where I am using third person point of view, as I did for my very first book, By My Hands On, I will have different plot lines going on because I think it makes for a more interesting story. And you'll notice this in television too. I didn't know I was going to get into this, but let me just quickly say this. It is not unusual to have two storylines in an hour-long program. Mm-hmm. There's an A story and a B story going on. Even in some like comedies like MASH, you'll see an A story and a B story, and it keeps things interesting.
Absolutely. Now, Molly, you also had kind of an interesting perspective on this and how to juggle multiple plot lines and why to use them, etc.
I did. Thank you for noticing. Let me share it with the group. For me, it's just a bit like writing life. There are times when we interact or intersect with others and times when we go our separate ways. A family doesn't always stay together, and they have their own random activities throughout the day, such as dad works, mom goes to buy the groceries, one kid is at school, another is at daycare. But in the evening, they all circle around again. And I think multiple plot lines are much like this. You need to find what the together aspect is and work outward from there to find where your characters go when they separate. Then write the story in reverse, and that is to write it first with the individual actions leading them to that community table. Aaron, you're on mute.
Working on it, sorry.
I see your mouth going, yeah, and I can't hear a thing.
Actually trying to do a couple things. I'm writing down Jacqueline's topic ideas is what I was working on. So I muted it so you didn't hear me typing. And I think it's probably, maybe our listeners like it better when I'm muted. I don't know, but so.
We're willing to give that a try.
I'm just trying to be courteous to everyone. So, so the question is, to really answer this, we have to ask ourselves, what do we mean by a plot line? So if we want kind of a tight answer, I would say that a plot line is a story thread. It's a single narrative that can weave together with others to create a larger story. So Pops, you have a more expansive definition.
Yeah, a plot line is a series of scenes with either a single task, a single goal that needs to be achieved in it, and it might be a secondary character that's doing that, or if you're doing point of view from an antagonist, his tasks will be different from the protagonist, and that's one of the beauties of it. You can get into the evil mind as well as the good mind, and let your reader see both sides of that. Or it's a series of scenes with a particular setting. So in what amounts to my second book, it came out third, but what amounts to my second book, Through My Eyes, the sequel to By My Hands, and the predecessor to In My Ear. Well, there was no book called that. Anyway, since it's an ensemble piece,
the team up my nose.
The teams, yeah, the team has to split, and there are different parts of the world doing things. So I had to have plot lines for each one. So when one's in Greece, I needed to see that. When the other's in Ethiopia, we needed to see that so we could get the full story.
This is very common. I'm sorry, Pops, go ahead.
Yeah, a multifaceted story will have multiple plot lines to it. So, and some characters need to be seen. They need a bigger stage to act on, even if they're not the protagonist.
Indeed. Yeah, it is becoming increasingly common to have multiple plot lines. And what I notice most often is that these scenes are told, as you say, Pops, from different characters' perspectives, from different times, or sometimes they're told from different characters' perspectives from the same time period, but they're separated by location. So the multiple plot lines come from a separation in time and space, time and or space, I guess. Molly, you were trying to define it as well.
Yeah, I just say, simply put, plot line is the story that you're trying to tell. And as Aaron said, it's weaving. So think of your story also like a small blanket, if you will. And you need to weave together several strong ones in order to make a blanket or a covering. That is several strong plots. You don't want the weak threads. You don't want the things that are a little bit useless or a different material. You want what works to bring it all together into unity.
Which brings up the next question. How many plot lines do we have in our novel, or should we have in our novel? Is there a proper number? Is there a rule for that? The answer is yes, 12.
Liar.
More than 12, it's too much.
He's
Less
lying
than 12, not
tonight,
enough.
folks. He's lying tonight.
I'm just going off topic. I'm winging it now. No, there's not. This is, again, there's no rule, or even if there were, it would be more of a guideline. I mean, think of something like the Game of Thrones series. It's got all the characters. They all have a perspective. They're all told and it detailed. You see this in fantasy. You see this in science fiction. There's not a particular number of plot lines or character perspective or character arcs, sub stories, whatever you want to call them. There's not a particular amount. You can have it really as many as you want. I would, as little as one, even if you're writing, especially in first person. But I would highly suggest that you do limit it to important characters. I've seen some people write from the perspective of a character who ends up dying, 2 pages later, and it feels like, why am I reading this? They never come back, or they have 2 scenes from their perspective, and that's it. Those types of things lead me to question whether or not they should be included in the first place. You want to limit your plot lines by the point of view. First and second person stories, you're really only going to have one. You can do multiple perspectives in first person. You can have multiple first person narrators in a novel. I've seen that done, but it's not as common. And again, anything that's kind of outside of the box sometimes can be risky if you're looking for a publishing contract, but it can be done. And I've seen it done very well, but it is more of a challenge. Usually first person, you stick with one perspective. And in that case, you can only follow that character's perspective. So you're only going to have one plot line, one single narrative. This works well when you are writing, as you say, Pops, mysteries. You want to reveal information in a timely fashion. But you also want to limit it. So you don't want to give all the information up front. So by limiting your perspectives and limiting your plot lines, you're also limiting the number of words, the number of pages, and it can create more of a mystery because the reader has less information as opposed to this big sprawling fantasy where you get to follow 22 different characters at different places in the world at different times, etc. So there's not an exact number. But Pops, you have a particular rule that you like to use.
Right. And I think we need to be clear about this because we've been talking about 2 things here, point of view and plot line, which is not the same thing. Point of view is the eyes we see through of the character. And so we're seeing the world through their eyes and feeling what they're feeling, experiencing what they're experiencing. A plot line has a goal in a beginning, a middle, and an end to it. So it's got a destination, and it should tie into the primary plot line. There's really one major plot line. That is the essence of your story. The other ones are slaves to that, and its purpose is to provide information to the reader. Now think about when you watch television. It's not unusual to see dramas from different characters' point of view, and it just helps the viewer get a bigger picture. That's the same thing when you're doing multiple plot lines and multiple point of views, because the 2 do go together, but they're not the same thing. Now, my rule is this. I almost always use the protagonist's point of view if the protagonist is present. Protagonist is the primary character, so if he or she is in the scene, then normally we're seeing it through his or her eyes. There have been a few times, but they're very rare, where I wanted someone to see what happened to the protagonist. that there was some reason, maybe somebody's working behind the scenes against the protagonist, and he can see and carry on a conversation with the protagonist. What's really important is what he's thinking, and my protagonist can't see. But general rule of thumb is, if the protagonist is there, that's the point of view you want to be in. Just allow yourself enough room that if there's a reason to depart from that, that you do so intentionally. It's not by accident or laziness. You tend to do that. I'm getting very big on the intentional writer who thinks about everything they put into a book. They intend it to be that way.
I think it's really important to be intentional, and I think that's why it's important to continue to study the craft. It's very easy to be a haphazard writer, but it's not easy to read a book that's written by a haphazard writer. It feels very unsatisfying. And so the intentionality of writing is very important, as you say, Pops. If you're in third person omniscient point of view, that allows you to follow several different characters' perspectives and therefore follow their plot lines as well. This can include antagonists. So you can really kind of play with the suspense by following what the bad guy is doing. This increases the number of plot lines that you're going to follow. And this is very, very typical to see, as I say, in a lot of genre fiction, such as fantasy, science fiction, adventure, etc.
I put in a word of caution on here. If you do this with several characters, you just want to make sure that the overall voice is consistent. You shouldn't be omniscient and first person. Is that right, Aaron? Or
so you technically do first person omniscient. It was done in.
I'm sorry. I mean, for like one character is presented as omniscient when you're narrating about this scene, and then with another character, it's first person.
That would be really weird to go between a first person and then a third person point of view. That's done. It has been. That happens in Moby Dick, but it's rarely done today because it's confusing for the reader a lot of times, and it feels, I think, haphazard and not intentional. I have seen some first person omniscient, which is normally you can't do it, but The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold, the character, the protagonist is dead, and so she's kind of narrating the life of her family afterward.
Yeah, and there what you have is a character in the God position. It's omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing. So you really can't have first-person omniscient unless the first person is God, because there's no omniscient individual, unless you take them out of the timeline, which is what you're talking about. And you're talking about this murder victim describing. So what that person is now the narrator, and they're narrating the story in the past tense of what happened that led to this point, and even maybe what happened after with that. But they have special knowledge; they can see that. If the person was still in the same timeline, still alive, they couldn't do that, and so that would probably be a fault in the telling of that. So, and when we're talking about things like third person omniscient, we're talking about the narrator. That is, this is the style of writing, especially came out of the 1900s, was very popular, where the narrator just steps in and tells you things that the character can't know. They just elbow their way in, and it's usually considered bad writing, or at least archaic writing at that. So third person omniscient is generally frowned upon. It does happen, and if it's in capable hands, I think Stephen King did once, and there's some others. It can be done. You have to remember that the narrator is now a character.
Under the Dome is
Under the Dome.
Yeah. And I think it's hard to talk about plot lines and perspectives without talking about point of view a little more deeply. But so I apologize if this sounds like a point of view lesson, but it's important to kind of understand some of these subtle differences. Third person omniscient, technically anything where you have multiple perspective characters is going to be omniscient, though it's a weird kind of, I guess maybe more of a synoptic third person limited, where you only have the perspective of the point of view character in a particular scene. When we say third person omniscient, what we're really saying is multiple character perspectives within the same scene. Did I say that correctly? Is that making sense?
Well, it could be a head hopping.
Mhm.
Often in omniscient, they go from one brain to another. Somebody yells at someone, and then the narrator tells us how the recipient feels, and then is immediately back in the offensive person's mind telling us why he did it. And it's very confusing. I think it's bad writing, unless you have some real skills in that. Now, you mentioned Under the Dome, Stephen King. He even does a point of view from an armadillo.
Oh.
Was it an armadillo?
It's like a chipmunk or a squirrel.
Some kind of critter that the dome falls on.
Mhm.
I think cuts them in half or something like that.
Mhm.
Dean Koontz did one from the point of view of a dog, a golden retriever. But you're talking the heavyweights here, that have been doing this for a lot of years, and they begin to pull that off. And even then, it's jarring. I found the dome very jarring.
I agree.
Same thing when they write in present tense. That just throws me. But it can be done. For the most part, I would stay away from that. You stay in one person's point of view. And when you have multiple plot lines, it isn't really just omniscient. It's what whoever the protagonist is, or the character is, even the antagonist, whoever point of view you're in that particular plot line, the protagonist may not even be there. We're seeing and experiencing things through them. Not through everybody there, just that person. Mm-hmm. So it's not really omniscient. It's more near, third person near, mm-hmm. third person close. You can take third person all the way to the point where it's the same thing as a first person story.
Mm-hmm. You can.
That's all you get to know is whatever. That's all the narrator reveals is what goes on in the mind of the character. It's that close.
We should do another podcast on non-traditional points of view. I think that'd be a lot of fun.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
That would be a lot of fun.
Maybe I'll have to add that to the list.
Dave, what has a question in the chat room, and I just because we're on this particular subtopic, he asks how about where a first-person narrator thinks he or she knows everything, but they don't?
So that feels a little bit personal, Dave. So I don't.
How does he know?
I don't know. I think
I haven't been sharing government secrets again or anything.
That can be fun. It can be challenging. Really, that sounds more like a character quirk to me. And I think the way that you would have to demonstrate that is to have the character make grandiose conclusions, come to these grandiose conclusions, and then be proven wrong. Have him make these conclusions or state these conclusions with such confidence and authority and arrogance, and then I assume this would be a he, is proven wrong. That way the reader can see that our narrator is unreliable, because really what you're talking about is an unreliable narrator.
Yeah, or it is the main character who's looking back. Or again, a non-traditional one. The Princess Bride, is narrated by the grandfather reading, who interrupts the story from time to time, and the grandson interrupts the story from time to time, and that becomes part of the narrative. But that's not typical, and you'd be hard pressed to find 5 books like that that people talk about or enjoyed.
Yeah, Dave, I just noticed in the chat room, my agent, Dave, wants me to talk about my current work in progress, which is second person present tense, which you should probably never, ever do. I did it just to make Dad angry. There you go, Pops. He refuses to read it. But I think maybe we'll try and do a non-traditional point of view podcast in the future, and I'll talk about it more then. But suffice it to say that second person, you should, especially for novels, probably not the right choice. Again, unless you're intentionally choosing it. I have intentionally chosen it for a reason, but I can share that later.
Why don't you give the audience an example of what that is? Because some people we're used to first and third, but not second. So what is second person?
Second person would be second poison. Yeah. It's been a long night. Second person would be you. You do this, you do that. Instead of I or me, instead of he, she, or they, it's you or your, etc. Very interesting. It's really an acquired taste, I feel. A lot of people just don't like it right away. A lot of people love it because it's different and unique. It's really a choice that you have to make on the voice of your narrator, because technically second person is still kind of an extension of first person. My character, I won't say too much, but my character has a reason for speaking and communicating to the reader in second person. It's an intentional choice, but again, we'll spend a little more time on that. Otherwise, I can't think of a valid reason to use second person. It's just a choice for the voice of the character, and you have to have a particular character. So it was
a literary term for it. Rebellion.
Yeah, rebellion.
Some people are drawn to the road less traveled, and the reason the road is less traveled is it runs off a cliff.
Is that going to be an Alsacian?
There's a reason the road is less traveled.
You're going to feel real bad when I fall off a cliff. So let's get back to plot lines. We are way off here.
It's okay, Aaron. We'll carry on the show in your absence.
Thank you. I would hope that. I would hope for nothing less. Let's get back to plot lines, because we have a lot to get through here before we're out of time. Remember, the question was, how many should I have? Again, there's no magic number, but just understand anytime you're going to add a plot line, it's going to increase your character count. It's going to increase your page count. If you're okay with that, that's fine. If you're, writing a novel that's already 200,000 words, maybe we need to trim that back some. And one of the quickest ways to trim up a story is to eliminate a plot line, eliminate a point of view character. Maybe not the character from the entire book, but you can eliminate the scenes told from their perspective. Is there a plot line that's not furthering the story? You can take those out as well. But just understand that there is kind of a breaking point. I like to use The Lord of the Rings as an example. I thought the movies were, I enjoyed them. I'll say that, because if I say I didn't like them, then we'll lose subscribers. But I really enjoyed them. But I did feel lost, especially toward the third one, where there was like 122 different characters. I hadn't read the books at the time that I saw the film. I was really confused. And then I read the books and I was like, okay, I'm still confused, because there's 122 different characters, and some of what they're doing matters and some of what they're doing doesn't matter. And it was hard to keep track. And so I'm not saying that Tolkien is a bad writer. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, for my taste, it got to be a little bit too much. And you want to avoid that. You want to make sure that your plot lines are still tightly told and tightly woven. Follow the balance that's going to give you the proper length and tell the story appropriately, tell a broad enough story to show all the different angles and facets that you want to demonstrate that this intriguing plot may have.
Another way to think of it is, how many bricks do you need to put in a wall?
Mm.
If you put in more than you need, you got a really weird wall. Or in other ways, and we could refer to Molly with her expertise in cooking, how much salt do you put on the food?
Just enough to add the right amount of flavor.
That's right. If you put too much, you ruin it.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't put enough, it's lackluster. So it's the same thing with plots. You put in what is necessary. Think of them as construction things. They come with beams and headers and foundations and studs or whatever. But think of them as things that you use to build. You don't want too much stuff. I was in a book, a nonfiction book I was working on for writers. I make this comment that some people think that they can take the back off a fine switch watch, throw in another gear, and expect it to work better.
Oh, goodness. No.
Okay? And that's the problem with putting in too many plot lines. You just keep throwing stuff in, and all you're going to end up with is a pile of plots and not much of a story. Okay, so you use what's necessary to get the job done. It's the overall story that matters.
Well, and side note here that I'm just thinking, because it's not in the notes, but you also want to make sure that they intersect at the right times. If you're using multiple plot points, you don't want them to tie up only at the very end. You want them to be able to intersect. That's why they're part of this same story. There's got to be some connecting factors throughout this whole storyline.
Yeah, that's a really good guideline. I'm not sure that it's a rule I've seen. I'm thinking of Stranger Than Fiction here, which is one of my favorite films, and that's got a kind of a bunch of random, completely disconnected plot lines. It seems like this woman who's looking for a job, and this kid who's learning to ride a bike, and this grocer who's selling apples on the corner market or whatever it is. And it just kind of keeps briefly flashing back to them, and you're like, why is this here? And then everything comes together in the last 10 minutes of the film, 15 minutes of the film, and you go, okay. And is it necessary? Could she have cut them, or possibly? But it is really interesting. It's a flavor. Do you like plot lines that intersect and weave together as you move through, or do you like everything to kind of be tied together in a nice, neat little knot, I guess, at the end? Some people say bow. I went with knot. It's really up to you. It's a flavor choice. It's a flavor choice. But one thing that is important is remembering that there's a master plot line, one primary plot line, and the others should serve that. Pops, you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how I think of it. There is really one plot, but to serve that plot, there may be action going elsewhere, and that action and that character may create a subplot. That's normally how you refer to them. There's the plot and the subplots. So, if you're reading Donald Moss's book or some of the others about writing, they'll talk about subplots. That's really what we're talking about here. There's one primary plot. That's how you get your protagonist from the first crisis to the end. And that's really where the story is. Now, for the reader to fully understand that, there may be some subplots necessary. So in one of my books, I wanted the people to understand why the antagonist, who is just a really bad guy, is the way he is. What happened to him that made him this way? And in the process, I wanted to heighten the fear they felt about this guy. So that's a little storyline that goes back in the past and gets up into the present in the storyline that helps us understand this nutcase and why he is the way that he is. Well, that serves the plot, but that's a subplot. It just gives us more information. So, and Molly's absolutely right. The subplots have to, at some point, be woven together in the end. They have to serve that plot. Otherwise, it's the extra gear in the Swiss watch.
Lost did a really good job of this, especially in the first season. The first season was really fantastic. And we won't talk about the subsequent.
I was going to say the second season was not so much.
We're not going to talk about that. But what I really liked about it was that it had, for an hour-long TV show, Pops, as you were saying, kind of storyline A, storyline B, plot one, plot A, plot B. Told it from, one was a flashback, one was a present tense. And as they went through, they didn't seem to be super connected, other than it was told from the same perspective, the same character perspective. But when you got to the end, the final flashback scene I don't want to call it a twist, but something major would happen in the past that makes you understand the character's decision in the present that otherwise would not make sense. Yeah, otherwise you'd say this character would never choose to do this. But when you see what's happened in his or her past, it makes more sense. And so that's a good example just of two threads that have kind of been woven together. And if you look at the season as a whole, and it doesn't resolve all of the plot points, it starts a lot of threads that don't get wrapped up until the final season, to varying degrees of success. But if you want to look at how that works, season 1 of Lost is actually a great thing to study. Go back through, watch it, first episode to last episode, and look at the plots that go together, that weave together, that the stories that are resolved, the stories that are left unresolved, and just remember that. Think about, why is this story unresolved? Why did they not talk about this particular thing anymore, even though they introduced it and made a big deal out of it? You have to look at the series as a whole, but that's 7 seasons or 6 seasons. Just the first season, that's all you need. But you can think of your novel that way. If I get to the end of my novel and there are threads in there that have not been tied together at the end, that have not had an impact on the larger story arc, the primary plot line, then these are things that we need to cut. One of the questions that was brought to us was, how do you find these lines? How do you find these plot lines? And so the way I like to think of it, and I'll kind of go through this as quickly as I can, because I want to make sure that we get through all our notes. But I took an art class in college. I absolutely loved this class. I am not an artist. Please don't think that I'm going to draw you a picture. I might, but it's not going to be good.
Bubble burst.
The most important thing that I learned in that class is the instructor said, I want you to find the lines. And it was this idea, he said, to sketch several different lines. So if I wanted to draw a straight line, I would begin by making a straight line, and then I would try and make that straight line again and again and again. And I would just do all these sketches of lines very lightly until I found the actual line that I wanted, whether it was a straight line or a curved line, especially curved lines. Where do you want the curve? At what kind of angle do you want the curve? Or I guess circumference do you want the curve? Those types of things. And then you kind of go through your sketches of 100, 200 different lines, and you find the line that kind of announces itself to find that right curve or the right angle. And that's what you darken in. And then all those other lines, you kind of go back and erase. Well, it took several lines to find that primary plot line, if you will. And so you can kind of think of it in that way. You start with a primary line, or what you want to be your primary plot line, and then you start asking yourself questions as you write. How does this particular decision at this particular juncture affect each of my characters? Not just the protagonist. How does it affect the other characters as well? What new paths does this open up for my characters that was previously closed off? What new characters might this plot thread reveal? Where do my characters need to be? If you're thinking ahead, you're planning ahead, where do they need to be? And what needs to happen to get them there? And how can I start that process now of getting them to where they need to be? How do I get them to take the proper steps? What steps do they need to take? So these are questions that you can ask yourself when you're writing or before you're writing, so that you can draw several different lines and find out which ones need to be there and which ones are just more of a distraction, if that makes sense. Whether you want to do that beforehand or while you're writing, it doesn't matter. Whatever works for you. We've talked about that before, but the idea is you should be thinking about how the ramifications of the decisions that your characters are making, because a lot of the plot lines really come from that.
Yeah, that's really an important thing to remember, is to keep the main plot, and remind yourself. The reason some writers have problems with this, especially intuitive writers, is they don't know this stuff yet. They don't know what's going to happen. And if you're an intuitive writer, you have to just get started on the primary plot. You keep writing, and then it will occur to you, you need something here. Something happened that affects us at this point. You might have to go back and write a subplot to make all that clear. But so you may not know it up front, but that's why you write a first draft. That's its whole purpose. The real writing comes in the second draft, and when you're doing all the editing and stuff. That's where the real joy is. So all of these are good points. Key to keep that story is the action of the key players, and that's the one you want to follow the most, the protagonist. If you follow another character too much, then they become the protagonist. So the story is the trunk of a tree, and think of any other story as a branch, but it must be connected to the trunk of the tree. You don't have a branch out here floating next to it. There is a connection. So make sure that they're all there. And you may find that as you get through there that you have some scenes, maybe a minor subplot you just don't need, and you end up cutting it out. Don't throw it away, save it. Sometimes they fit in other books. But you just realize this just does not fit. And so you take it out. Sometimes a writer must remind himself or herself of that premise, the big picture. You got to keep coming back to it. This character is the hero who must fix the problem. Otherwise, you've got the wrong protagonist. So keep in mind why the protagonist must succeed. What's driving him? What's driving her? What happens if she fails? Keep reminding yourself of that, and that'll keep you on the primary plot line. The other plot lines will develop out of it. It grows out of it.
And you said something there, Al, that I had actually was going to put a note in there too, which is keep notes, keep your snippets, because often with our first drafts and follow-ups, we'll change subtleties. But you'll discover on version 2.8 that you may discover you want to revert something back to the original. And I recently found a passage I'd removed from NOLA, but during this current rewrite stage, it's going to go back in. And I'm very excited for that. It's just something that I discovered the way I'm rewriting it. It works better to have it back in as the original. So your characters will dictate that to you. Just be sure you're listening to them.
Yeah, you do have to pay attention to that. In the Harbingers, I would outline each novella because I had to write in very short order. I had to do it quickly. I would get the previous book, and I'd have to digest it and see what's going on there. and then get my story done and out so the next person could do theirs. And I found the best way for me to do that is to do a type of outline where I just come up with chapter titles. That works for me for some reason. But then as I'd go along, I would come to the next chapter and realize I don't need that. It doesn't fit. So I just take it out of the outline. It seemed to fit when I first did it, but I reminded myself constantly, this is not writ by the hand of God and a stone tablet. You know, it's meant to be adjusted. I remind people we didn't get to the moon in one straight shot. There's lots of mid-course corrections. So you do your outline. If you're an outliner, you do that. Just understand you may be pulling chunks of it out. And that's all right. It's not a waste. It helped get you to that point.
Right.
And then you may find that you've written a scene and you think, now I need a scene to explain this. I know we're running out of time. I gotta throw this out. In my book, Enoch, I have a character, and how do I explain this? He was a minor character who became the protagonist. I could not get rid of him.
Wow.
It's the only time it's ever happened to me. But there's a scene between him and Enoch. For those not familiar with Enoch, there's two people listed in the Old Testament as having never died, Enoch and Elijah. And the verse about Enoch's very short. Is Enoch walked with God and was no more, for God took him, and that's it. He just didn't die. He just gone. And I said, well, let's bring him back. That'd be fun. So I thought he was a protagonist. He wasn't. He has an altercation with a young man. The young man has an altercation with him. And I kept writing scenes with this young guy in it because I had to tidy up something. Turned out he was really the hero of the story. And I did not know that until I was 80 pages into the book, that I was backing the wrong horse. So you have to be flexible.
I think we all have stories about that type of thing. Maybe not where a minor character becomes a protagonist, maybe not that extreme, but where a minor character becomes a much more major character. I've given the example of Veronica, the one-legged waitress in The Bargain, who was a throwaway character. She came in as a joke, and for whatever reason, she stuck around, and I couldn't get rid of her, and she ends up playing an integral part of the story. And so, and it came from following a plot line with her. I've had plot lines in Hand of Adonai. Goodness knows I've had those. And you wouldn't believe how many I've had to cut. And some of them were great scenes, but definitely led me down a rabbit hole that I didn't have time to pursue. And so that scene had to go. And sometimes it's not one scene, sometimes it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. It's best, by the way, if you figure that out sooner rather than later, so you don't have to cut 120 different. It was easy for me because when I went back on the second read through, I went, oh yeah, I never talked about that again. I'll just take it out. So that was pretty easy for me. But sometimes you get 2 or 3 scenes deep and you realize this is not working. And if you can identify why it's not working, and if it's harming the story, then you got to do some pruning. You got to cut it. That's
the heart of creativity. That whole process is the heart of creativity. That's what it means. And I don't know where we get this idea, especially new writers, is they need to sit down and start writing and it needs to come out perfect. No, it's all exploration. Your first draft is exploration. You do your best. You outline if you're an outliner. If not, you follow your instincts if you're an intuitive writer. But you're going to be making changes. That's part of it. Because your subconscious does not reveal everything up front. It's stingy.
It really is. So we've got a quick list here. 5 minutes. We'll go fast. We don't have a lot of time for explanation, so we'll keep these on the show notes for you. But it's a quick list. It's a list. It's not quick. It's a list of do's and don'ts. So I'm going to just kind of read through these real fast. Does that sound okay, Pops?
It's fine with me, yeah.
So things in terms of juggling multiple plot lines, things you should do. You should move between perspectives that follow narratives, making sure to move, apparently I was going to read this, not well. This was Pop's note, and so I'm just having trouble reading it. Be sure to make moves clear to the reader, meaning moving from perspective to perspective, plot line to plot line. Use a hiatus break, which is a white line, to signal a change in either perspective or a change in time or a change in location. So it's one of those three things.
Yeah.
And you either do just a white line, or I do scene breaks. I do just 3 little asterisks. And to me, whenever I shift between perspective characters, I always do that. Make it clear. You want to try to allow equal time so that readers don't forget particular characters and whatever quests they may be on. But you also want to make sure that the protagonist is getting his or her proper weight in the story. So they may have the majority of the scenes. They will have the majority of the scenes. But find the right balance for your novel. Do make sure that the shifts in time and place and perspective are very clear. We already talked about that. Remind readers very briefly where characters are and what they're working toward. So that might just simply be, after Arthur had slain the beast, he continued toward the Holy Grail. Whatever quest it is, just a simple reminder of where they had been and what they were working on, so that we can recall where they are and what their quest is, what their motivation is, so that we can follow their story without interruption. Do keep track of who is where and what they know and what each scene reveals. This goes back to Molly's point about keeping notes. It's very, very easy to forget which character knows what. So you can keep a story Bible like we've talked about. Timestamps really help out here. You don't have to keep them in there forever, but if you just timestamp each scene, then it will help you keep track of what's happening when, where, why, and how. If you want to go back and take them out later, you can, or you can keep them in if you think that helps the reader remain oriented. Make sure that your scenes are relevant. Again, we've talked about this. If it's not moving the story forward, you've got to cut them. Pops, we mentioned a couple things. You mentioned 3 things, and then I wanted to one-up you, and so I ended up 2-upping you and coming up with 5 things. So, Pops, you say every scene needs to do 3 things: move the story forward.
One of 3 things, right?
I'm sorry, thank you. One of 3 things: either move the story forward, or reveal information that the reader needs, or set up action to come. And really, I think my list is the same as yours. I was just a little more explicit with some of the things. So I said each scene should either introduce a new conflict, or escalate an existing conflict, or resolve a conflict, not necessarily completely wrap it up, but maybe resolve it a little bit, maybe resolve one aspect of a conflict, or develop and deepen characters and relationships between characters, or set up action that is to come. So I think you said it a little more succinctly with moving the story forward. I just wanted to be sure that in context of story, that it's think of conflicts and characters, conflict and character, and then foreshadowing. Those are the 3 things that your scene should be doing. Try and bring everything together at the end, tie it all up, whether that's in a neat bow or not, whatever makes you feel better. The closer toward the end that everything gets pulled together, typically results in a very satisfying ending for the reader. For whatever reason that is, they like to see everything kind of get tied up close to the end, and that's satisfying to them. Make sure that that all your plot lines are tied up there. If they're not, you need to go back and cut some. Readers don't like being left with questions. Pop, you've talked about Dark Moon before, and how some of the people didn't like the ending because, well, why don't you tell me?
Dark Moon's about a red spot that appears on the moon and begins to grow, and it has some effect in society, but some specific individuals. More importantly, that's what the story Dark Moon is about. And then it begins to shrink and disappears. And I never explained what this red spot is. And the reason is none of my characters could know. I really wrestled with it. There's just no way to know. Nobody knows what it was. So I had to leave it open. And some readers wanted me to, as Clive Cussler did, send my people to the moon. He did that in one of his stories. It's just not going to happen. And I mean, at least the way my story was, that wasn't going to happen with my characters. And the point I was trying to make is sometimes you don't know, but readers don't like that.
They don't. I've written especially short stories like that have open resolutions that, man, readers really don't like it. If you do it properly and you do it well, then it can be done, especially in the short form. But with novels that have open resolutions, typically readers don't like those. So if you're going to do that, just understand that it's a risk, and you need to be able to do it very expertly and very masterfully. I would say think No Country for Old Men, even though a lot of people still didn't like the ending of that. You got to the end and you're like, wait, what? What just happened? If you go back and read it a second time, it makes a lot more sense. A lot more sense. But the first read through can be super unsatisfying. Things not to do. Don't neglect characters for too long. If you give them a perspective and you go, 80, 90 pages without coming back to their perspective, maybe they don't need a perspective. Maybe you can cut it out. But it's really frustrating getting 17 pages into a scene and realizing, oh, this is from that other character's point of view that we haven't seen in 100 pages. That can be very jarring or jarring for a reader. Don't repeat information that we've already read. Don't confuse what characters know. And I've already kind of said that. Keep a story Bible, and that's going to help out. One of the ways that you can avoid doing that is just by using a little bit of summary. Frankie explained the whole ordeal to Sally before they got on the bus. That's all we need. We don't need a rehash of it. We don't need to see Frankie actually explaining it. That can be somewhat redundant. So that was my lightning list of do's and don'ts. It will be on the show notes at aarongansky.com tomorrow morning, late morning, early afternoon, if you're interested in that. Before we sign off, which I just about did on instinct alone, Molly, do we have any questions from the chat room?
Yes, we have a few. Trey Meshi was in the chat room at the beginning and asked, what are your thoughts on making a novel too literary? I find books that are beautifully written are not as successful as commercial fiction.
Trey, that's a really good question. Pops, if you don't mind, I'll handle that. I had this issue with The Bargain. Some of you have heard me tell the story before, but when I wrote The Bargain, I wanted it to be literary. I wanted to show off how smart I was. And so I did exactly that. And what I proved to the entire world is that the world still doesn't like a show off. It was not impressive. Publishers didn't like it. They found it very pretentious and off-putting. And that's simply because it was pretentious and off-putting. Now, that being said, I had to come to a point where I got over myself. I, had to put my ego to rest and realize that I was trying to show off as an author. I wanted to be an author rather than a storyteller. And I would qualify the difference as a storyteller as one who gets out of the way of the story. They still make it beautiful. They still do what they can to weave together multiple plot lines and develop wonderful characters and write very beautiful prose. But when the beautiful prose gets in the way of the plot and the characters, then it's too much author, not enough story.
One of Al's axioms: never ever try to sound like a writer.
Yeah, let the story tell itself. And Trey, to your point about literary books not selling as well as commercial books, you're right. That's just simply the state of it. Commercial books seldom win Pulitzer Prize. Literary books seldom become super huge international bestsellers. Occasionally you'll get one that does, but not often. In terms of sales numbers, I don't know if Harry Potter I don't think that won the Pulitzer. I'd have to double check. But it's an incredibly well-written book that's a lot of fun. And just well done. And so really what I would say, Trey, is I think it's a myth that you have to choose. I think you can write literary commercial fiction. And that's really what I try and do. I try and write commercial fiction that is literary and still done beautifully and masterfully, still study the craft, still try and learn. And then you're not necessarily having to pick. That's what I would say.
Think of Ray Bradbury. If his stories were not sci-fi fantasy, he wasn't a true sci-fi writer, mostly fantasy stuff, but his work is beautiful. The topic, nobody would consider him a literary author, but boy, some of his passages are just fabulous. So if he was writing something else, he might have been called that, though I don't think he ever wanted to be. But
yeah. He still has a lot of literary respect. He really does. A lot of credibility in that, especially with Fahrenheit 451 and a lot of his short works. But you're right. He's not a William Shakespeare. He's not spoken of in that regard. Even though, can we just be honest? William Shakespeare wrote commercial fiction. Yeah. He did. He wrote what his audience wanted to see, and he did it beautifully.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be either or. So Trey, thanks for joining us. I know you're not currently in there. Hopefully we didn't run you off, but we enjoyed having you with us there at the beginning. Other questions, Molly?
Yes. Stephen asks, are there any thoughts on holding back subplot information for a second book that would parallel the first timeline using the subplot characters? So basically, as I'm reading the question, telling the same story from the second set of characters.
I almost feel like maybe I'm interpreting this the wrong way, but you've got Team A and Team B, and book number 1 follows Team A, and book number 2 follows Team B.
Yeah, that's how I'm reading it.
Where a subplot becomes its own primary plot. You can do that. There are advantages and disadvantages, especially if you have 350 pages worth of plot A and 350 pages of plot B. You're probably going to want to do that in 2 books. Do you want to weave them together? Possibly, but then you have to start thinking about story arcs and what is the arc of this particular novel. I had to do that with Hand of Adonai. It was one long book and it was way too long. And so I had to make the choice to break it into multiple books. And I had to look at it with the new narrative arc for each particular one. So yeah, you can do that. Pops, did you have anything on that?
I would say most publishers probably wouldn't touch it because they would say the story's already been told. All you did was change the characters. And my guess is it would be a difficult sale to do that. I mean, it sounds like a novel idea, if you pardon the pun. It's a novel. But I don't see it working. I wouldn't advise it.
Yeah, maybe we're thinking of this differently. But if you're, okay. So if you tell the same story and character A and B are there the whole time, and then you want to write another book, but this time it's B telling the story instead of A, I'm with you, Pops. I would advise against that. I'm not sure that that's gonna.
Well, but his question says, any thoughts on holding back subplot information for a second book? So I think like giving, like you said, Team A with just their perspective, and so the second book would be Team B with their perspective, their information, their journey. So it'd be parallel but different journeys.
Well, if you're doing a real epic kind of thing where I don't know, there's a war on a planet or something like that, and there's going to be different places with different heroes facing different problems, but it's on the same world, then that's a different thing. That's more of an epic kind of story, and really a compilation of different stories, and you could probably get away with that. That they're too closely tied, though. Which I think it would be if you're holding information out of one book for another book. You might mention something that will show up in the other book, but isn't integral to the first story.
If I'm thinking about that, it almost sounds as if you're trying to say A and B are on a journey. In order to accomplish their goals, they have to split up. So, chapters 1 through 10, you've got A and B, but after chapter 10, B completely vanishes. And then he comes back right at the end in chapter 100, then that could be problematic if we're not seeing what's happening with B. And then if you resolve the primary conflict with B there and he just appears out of nowhere, I think then the reader feels like, wait a minute, I've missed this. That's not going to be good. However, if A and B separate and you just finish telling the story with A, that's fine. And then you finish B story in another book, you could probably do that where you introduce a character and a subplot. But I would be very wary. Whatever subplots you introduce, I would wrap up. It's going to be real tough to start a thread and not wrap it up by the end of the novel, or at least remind people that the thread is still going. That was a very complicated answer.
But it was good. That was a complicated question. It was good. So, last question comes from Jacqueline Patterson, and she is asking, are there any tips for making an alien sound more like an alien?
I would qualify, and Pops, I'd love to hear your answer on this. I would think that this kind of falls under the same category as if you're talking about space alien, I think it would fall under the same rules as writing about an alien, someone in a different country. Their language is probably going to be somewhat broken or idiomatic. The idioms would be different. Then you're not going to have a non-native English speaker saying "What's up?" or whatever the case may be. Their idioms are going to be a little bit different. I love Short Circuit, and maybe this is probably not the best example, but the Indian character who can't get any of our idioms right, and he keeps getting them all mixed up. Or Biff, who says, "No, make like a tree and get out of here," where they are constantly getting things wrong. So you can have a little bit of fun with that. I would throw in bits of their language, not all of it, but in occasional words, especially proper nouns. That gives the sense of strangeness and otherworldliness, and can also help to world build without actually having to build an entire world. It just suggests a larger world. Those are some of the things that I would recommend. Pops, what would you do?
Well, my first snide remark was, well, what are your readers? They're human, and everything's going to have to be designed for them to understand. But you can certainly build a character that's an alien. You know what I'm thinking of? I'm thinking of Orson Scott Card's Enemy Mine. I think they did a movie. Luke Gossett was in it, I think. I think we could get a movie from it, but it was a short story. Maybe what they in science fiction would call a novelette, or maybe a novella, as I recall, Enemy Mine. And it's a human and an alien that are pretty well stuck together. So, yeah, I think you can do that, but remember, it's always going to go through the eyes of a human into a human brain. So you make sure that what you're doing is clear and believable.
There is a great, I can't think of it now, great episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Picard is stranded on a planet, and there's an alien there. They're kind of stuck together, like you were talking about, Pops. They can't communicate. The alien speaks English. The universal translator is able to translate what he's saying to English, but they still can't communicate because everything in their language is not necessarily idiomatic, but historically based. So if they want to say this, proud, they would say, Tokar at this, that, at this battle or whatever. And it's the idea of, pride and arrogance or whatever it is. And everyone understands it because they know the history. But, when you're coming from a different planet, that means nothing to you. So look up Star Trek: The Next Generation language episode. Maybe it'll pop up. Maybe I'll try and find it in the show note and leave it in the show notes. But it's a great, great episode. Even if you've never watched Star Trek: The Next Generation, watch it.
Yeah, he speaks in metaphor.
Yes.
And the problem was Picard didn't know the story, so he couldn't understand what was being said.
So I'm looking up Star Trek Darmok. Darmok. Yeah, Star Trek: The Next Generation. The episode is called Darmok.
Darmok.
Yeah.
There you go.
Super great. His face wet.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so
meaning
good.
Sadness. Yeah.
So good. We need to do a Star Trek podcast. All right. We are way over time here. Thanks for sitting with us and sticking with us and asking all these wonderful questions. We do appreciate it. We're going to go ahead and sign off unless I'm missing anything, guys.
Next week.
We're all good except next week.
Next week, we will be doing...
In 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Thank you. Next cast, we will be doing Gross Anatomy of a Novel. I promise it won't be gross. Gross Anatomy of a Novel. We're looking at character next week. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and how it's different than the other character podcasts that we've done. We look forward to seeing you there in 2 weeks at aarongansky.com. If you're looking for Pops, you can find him at altongansky.com. You can find Molly at frankly-my-dear-mojo.com. Please don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter and refer a friend. Like, subscribe, do all that wonderful stuff. And until next week, thank you all for listening and good writing.